Can I ask you, for years we've been living in a postmodern society where in essence, rather than talk about faith in science and reason and data and logical argument, and rather than think that there are truths to be established, truth is in the eye of the beholder. Call it radical relativism if you like. And yet you've just touched on an area where, in the biological sciences, there seems great confusion over the issue of gender, great confusion. That's an area where it would seem to me that there's a break between what most people feel is workable and where some of the elites are going on it. And we don't seem to want to listen to the science. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think the science here is reasonably clear. In other areas, particularly in this country, on climate change and on COVID, the media endlessly tell us we must follow the science. Where do you think public faith in science has gone? Because we seem almost schizophrenic about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Where has public faith in science gone? In dreert, to use a Yiddish expression. It's gone into the ground. And part of this is a communication problem. I mean, the scientists are not very good at appearing humble and non-arrogant in public. And certainly, the general public who recoils from science and scientific thinking, especially if it involves mathematics, has noticed this. It's part of a general sense, perhaps engendered by the internet, I really don't know, that there is something corrupt in any elite formation, no matter whether it's scientific, religious, practical, political. There's a wholesale rejection of elite formations, domination, hierarchies in favor of what would appear to be a kind of a rustic form of anarchy. Every man for himself, every truth for himself or itself. This is, of course, insane. It's just a disastrous recipe for the 21st century, which is, if it's going to survive at all, it's going to be technologically sophisticated. We have no alternatives. When I look at the United States and I see people announcing plans for survival mode and trekking off to the woods in order with a dozen heavy machine guns on their back, or otherwise preparing to live in splendid isolation as civilization collapses, I think these people are just nuts. It's not going to happen. Either civilization flourishes or it's not going to survive. And if you're sitting out there in the Rocky Mountains hoping that your cabinet's going to shelter you, you're deluded. But I think it's a very interesting question. I don't want, even for a minute, to suggest I've got a well-worked out answer, but I think anarchy and anarchism have become the default position for a great many febrile intellects. It's the first thing that comes to mind in any protest. Let's get rid of all authorities. Now, you see it in Seattle, for example. As a result of Black Lives Matter, a group of protesters took over 6 square blocks of the city, made a complete mess of it, refused all outside authority, and finally had to be removed by force. And it was entirely predictable to anyone who follows anarchist movements. They dissolve. They're a catastrophe. You can't run a society on anarchist principles. The great trouble with anarchism is anarchy, obviously. And yet, increasingly, I think, relatively sophisticated people who have never had the responsibility of administering anything are looking at a form of anarchy, eliminate all forms of authority, as a remedy for the 21st century. I think it's a disastrously misguided policy. When it comes to science in particular, I don't think, for example, that global warming science has covered itself in glory, even if it's true that with the exception of 1/10 of one global science, climate researcher, there is a consensus. That's really not the issue. It's not whether everybody working on climate science agrees, it's whether the agreement is merited. And the decision by the scientific establishment to say, absolutely it's merited, terrible things are coming, don't even for a minute begin to doubt it, I think that was a catastrophic mistake. hiding emails, trying to suppress the publication of dissenting views. This all goes on to the present day. It's very difficult to make a critical case contrary to the official case that bombing will become an acute problem within the next 10 years, the next 5 years. It's just too hot right now here in this room. That's not a good thing. The kind of deliberation one would have hoped to see, measured, calm, reflective, involving not only climate scientists, but economists, political theorists, and the general public, that really hasn't taken place. Right now, the consensus has won. Everybody on the planet is more or less convinced that within the next 10 years, the oceans are going to start boiling. It's not going to happen, I assure you, but my voice doesn't count. Most people, I mean, there are even some people who say, I refuse to have children in this rotten world because we're bringing the planet to a point of crisis. I've heard some people say it's absolutely nuts. We're not bringing the planet to a point of crisis. There are problems, there are technical problems, and they'll be solved technically. We're not going to give up industrial civilization on a whim. I think that's one area where the scientific community could have done a whole lot better. It could have been far, far less arrogant about what it was doing, far more realistic. I mean, the point of realism is to say, look, nobody is going to allow modern civilization to collapse. No one. If it means heating up the planet, we do that before we go back to the Stone Age. I think in the case of COVID, it's quite different. The real fact about COVID is that the world was immunologically naive in 2019. And no one knew a thing about this pandemic. People learned very rapidly, structure-wise, what a coronavirus was, what the spike protein was. But there was a learning curve. And I think a lot of the confusion, for example, about masks, nobody knew whether you should put on a mask, not here in France, not anywhere. A lot of the confusion was honest. It was epistemological confusion. People really trying to come to grips with the pandemic. After all, the world has not suffered a pandemic like this in almost a century. Almost a century. All the reflexes, the facilities, the structure, the administration necessary to deal with it had been allowed to lapse. Nobody ever figured that, 5 million people would die in the 21st century because of a respiratory virus? That wasn't on anyone's horizon. If it was on somebody's horizon, he was widely derided, or dismissed, or shuffled off into some minor post. So I have a lot more understanding of the scientific community's reaction to COVID, and I think it was humanly understandable. On the other hand, the ability of the large pharmaceutical houses, constant targets of appropriate, to come up in record-breaking time with an understanding of the structure of the virus and a reasonably effective vaccine, not perfect. It does not confer immaculate immunity, but it's brought some parts of the pandemic under control. I think that's been a miraculous achievement. Very, very much underappreciated. The amount of work, ingenuity, discipline, and the enormous body of biochemical, molecular, biological knowledge that was necessary to accomplish this task. Chapeau, that's all I can say. Needless to say, I've had myself immunized 11 times just to be on the safe side.
Well done. I hope you are safe.